Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue looking at endgames of some of the greatest players of all time. Today we are going to have a look at endgames by the world champion Magnus Carlsen. I've had a very tough time selecting his games because he is so well known for his precise endgame play and basically winning games that no one else could win. So I had a couple of criteria. Firstly, I wanted games which are less known. Secondly, I wanted games in which his opponents did have some chances to hold a draw. And thirdly, I wanted games which are remarkable and show just how insanely good he is at calculation and at planning and at endgame strategy. Okay, so I've chosen games which are quite old. And please give me recommendations for newer games. I have a selection already, but I would like to hear your feedback and your recommendations, and I'm going to be making part 2 of this video. Okay, so if you're a patron of mine, you can find the PGN for the video in the feed with my analysis and some comments. Okay, I've selected 3 games. The first one is from the Youth Experience match or tournament played in 2006 when Magnus was 16 years old. Karyakin played it, Van Hau played it, and for the experienced players there was John Nunn, who played this game, Ljubomir Ljubojevic, Artur Yusupov, Belyavsky, Uf Alderson, extremely experienced legends of chess. The second game is Mamedyarov Magnus from Wijk 2008. Magnus was 18, and the third one was from the Bazna Kings tournament in 2011. So all the games are at least 9 years old. So older Magnus games. Okay, so the first one is John Nunn Magnus Carlsen. Carlsen has the black pieces. It's equal material rook, bishop, knight, and it's a very interesting position in which many things are possible. But some things are certain, and that's that both sides have weaknesses. White, of course, has a weakness on b3, and black has weaknesses on f5 and c5. So when you compare the two weaknesses, or the weakness for both sides, black has 2 weaknesses, but white's weakness is much more important because the f-pawn is not as far advanced, although it could be extremely dangerous. The b4 pawn is already very advanced, and if b3 falls, then the b pawn is way more dangerous than the f pawn if the f5 pawn should fall. That being said, in compensation for that, black actually has 2 things to target. It's white is already looking at the f5 pawn, and he is attacking the c5 pawn once. The c pawn could be attacked again with rook d5, so the position should be balanced, but it's extremely hard to play. Okay, so the first thing, Magnus has to defend his f5 pawn, so bishop h4. There is no other sensible way to defend this. Okay, so pins the knight, the pawn cannot be taken. If in this position Nunn had simply played king to g2, then Magnus has no better option but to exchange the knight, because otherwise f5 is going to drop. If knight e2, then rook d2. So bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and now probably knight a5 would give Magnus enough counterplay, and after something like rook d6, king c7, bishop c5, probably rook b3, maybe, but I'm not sure. After rook b3 the position should be equal, and I don't see any issues after, for example, rook b3. And let's say knight takes c4, rook takes b4, rook takes b4, bishop takes b4, draw. Okay, so this was the sensible way to play. Now maybe, John Nunn is definitely in my top 5 list of best players of all time, an absolute genius. Probably he was kind of pushing it because Magnus was still young. Of course, Magnus was already one of the best players in the world when he was 16. He was nowhere near his current strength, but he was extremely strong. So instead, Nunn played something risky. I'm sure he'd seen king g2, this simple idea. Instead, he played rook to d5. And this move aims to trade weaknesses. Well, first of all, white can now white is now going to lose the b3 pawn, but he's going to be able to take on c5. Of course, retreating the rook to a5 would give black nothing. So Magnus bravely takes on b3, and now, of course, not bishop c5, but rook c5. And this now gives white the option to play a discovered check and win the f5 pawn with check. For the moment, the material is equal. But watch what Magnus does, and this, I think, is extraordinary. You have to calculate brilliantly, you have to play without any emotions, you have to play without any biases towards tactical motifs you know are dangerous. So moves like king b7, just bad moves. So he plays rook c3. Now this discovered check is coming, whatever happens. But the important thing is he's looking at the c4 pawn, and more importantly, his b pawn is about to move forward. So Nunn plays rook f5 check. We have king a6, getting away from the dark squares, and now king to e2. King to e2 is a mistake, and again I think Nunn had an opportunity to simplify, and let me show you how. Instead of king e2, he could have played rook c5, and in this position he simply defends his c4 pawn, attacks the knight. So after knight a5, attacking the c4 pawn again, he could have played bishop d4, and in this position bishop d4 just forces a trade. So rook d4, rook c4, rook c4, knight c4, and again with a completely equal position, this is just a draw. And because Nunn is such a brilliant player, I don't think he could ever miss a move like rook c5. Instead he played king e2, which is a much more active move, and of course this pawn is rolling forward too, and perhaps Nunn was thinking, well, I have stuff like knight e4, my king could come to d3 or to d2, this pawn could be stopped either by bishop d4 or something similar. But now this of course gives up the pawn, so rook takes c4, and in this position Nunn plays rook c5, and he would of course love to see rook c5, bishop c5, king b5 draw on the board, but instead Magnus plays knight d4 check. And now unfortunately for Nunn, the worst thing that could have happened happened. Now you have to take, if you don't play bishop d4, then your rook is dropping. For example, king d3, rook takes c5. So bishop takes and rook takes. And now this is a simplified position, bishop versus knight, in which again both sides have weaknesses. This is a weakness, this is a weakness. However, this pawn is 3 squares away from queening. This pawn is 4 squares away from queening. More importantly, black has a bishop, white has a knight. We know that when there are pawns on both sides of the board, bishops are incredibly useful because they can defend and attack at the same time. Knights cannot do that. Knights are sort of stuck, and their mobility is well, bad compared to bishops. So in this position, bishop definitely better than a knight. Okay, king e3 played, attacks the rook. And in this position, a great move, just b3. And this maybe Nunn did miss. I don't expect he would miss it if he'd been looking for it, but he probably missed it here because it just gains a tempo. So in this position, if king takes rook, then of course b2, and you have no way to stop the pawn. You can delay it a bit with rook c6, but king b7 still defends. You could play rook h6 here, and I can just queen, but I can also just save my bishop. I can play bishop d8, and you're still not preventing me from queening. If rook h7, then bishop c7, and I queen on the next turn, and I've saved my bishop. So after b3, the rook is immune. Nunn plays rook c1. Now, of course, the king takes d4 is a threat, and well, because the rook can come to b8. So rook b4, and now we have, whoa, excuse me, rook c1, not rook c8, and rook to b4. And now we have, so if king takes rook, the rook gets behind and saves the position. So after rook c1, rook b4, now we have a passed pawn with a rook behind it, which is the ideal placement of the rook. You don't want your rook to be on the opposite side because then it hinders the mobility of your pawn. When the rook is behind the pawn, then the pawn can simply move forward, gaining space and increasing the scope of the rook as it moves. So this is perfect. Knight e4 played. Of course, Magnus wouldn't have traded the bishop for the knight, but still the knight has to get into play. Now b2, rook b1 is forced. And now king b5, the king starts marching forward. And now watch what happens. Nunn starts getting his own counterplay going. King c4, f6. There's no need for any sacrifices. That probably would lead to a draw, but Magnus just plays actively with king b3, f7, because he has bishop e7. And now we see this bishop being a complete monster. What if the bishop should get to g7, then it's going to be defending and attacking at the same time, and Magnus is simply going to have time to attack the rook. So king d3 played by Nunn. Rook to b8, giving more support to the queening square and preparing to perhaps move the bishop away to check away or to defend if need be. Knight d2 played, king a2 attacks the rook. It's for the moment defended by the knight, but still the rook wants to move away, wants to have, well, increased mobility. Rook e1 played in this position, and if you queen, then I take with the knight, you take with the rook, and I take your bishop, and in fact white is going to be the one winning the game. So rook d8 check, and in this position king c4 played. If you play king to c2, then I can just take and takes and queens. Okay, so in this position that would be game over because my bishop controls the pawn. So king c4, bishop a3 now defends the queening square and the pawn. Rook to e2 pins the pawn to the king. Rook to d7 attacks the f7 pawn, so that has to be defended with the rook f2. And now simply bishop f8, the bishop drops back and transfers to the most active diagonal. After king c3, that's indeed what happens, bishop g7. And now you can see just how much better a bishop is than a knight in these sorts of endgames, even though you could argue that the knight is perfectly placed. The king goes to c4 again. If king to c2, then rook takes d2 again, and if king takes d2, b1 equals queen, and if rook takes d2, b1 equals queen is checkmate. So yeah, because of this bishop here. So king c4, rook c7 check, king d3, rook d7 check, king e4, driving the king away, and now rook to d4 check again. This king is now getting away from the action squares, which is, well, around here. The king would like to be around here. The king goes to f5, and now a great move. And I think many of us would miss a move like this, but that's why Magnus wins this games every time. So rook d6, and this king is now not entering the position. Of course, it's also blocking the rook, so it's not possible to queen and grab the bishop. Also, the king cannot approach the rook and attack the rook. So in this position, Nunn goes a bit crazy, which is understandable. He saw a way to draw the position. Unfortunately, Magnus is too good of a player. He was 26-75, so better than Nunn at the time, but yeah. Okay, so f8 equals queen, bishop takes, and knight c4 was the idea. Attacking the pawn twice, attacking the rook, but simply king b3, and this is game over. After rook takes b2 check, then of course king takes c4, rook b8 was played. Rook b8 was played in this position, attacking the bishop, but now rook d5, king e4, bishop d6, rook c8 check. Now in this position you don't want to blunder. This is what John Nunn was going for. You don't want to play rook c5, because after rook c5, king c5, this is a drawn endgame. For example, if king f5, then you can play h6. If king g6, you can defend. And for example, king f5, you can grab this pawn. Whatever happens, this is a draw. This is a bishop of the wrong color. So for example, king f5, bishop g5, king g4, draw. This, because the bishop doesn't control the queening square, it's a draw, even though black is a bishop and the pawn up. So after rook c8, you need a bit more final precision, so bishop c5. And after rook to c7, attacking the pawn, rook h5, this is game over. King f3 played, rook takes h2, king g3, and we don't have to move forward. This is an easy win. This is how it happened. Rook h6, king g2, king d5, rook c8, bishop d6. You need to be precise. You still cannot trade rook for bishop, because that would be a draw. Now he's cut off the king on the back rank, and now it's easy. Now you just need to force the king into the corner and start moving your pawn forward. King g1 played, bishop g3 attacks the rook, rook f1, rook g2 check, king h1, and bishop f2. And in this position, John Nunn resigned. Well, why did he resign? There are no stalemate tricks. If you move your rook away somewhere, then you're going to get mated. And if you don't do anything, then I just move my pawn, move my king, and eventually play rook g1 check when it's defended twice. So I think this was a remarkable game. I think that in this starting position, which is very imbalanced, where Magnus has two weaknesses and where Nunn was actually the one trying to play for the win, Magnus showed extreme prowess and great precision. And even though Nunn had chances to draw, Magnus just, well, outplayed him and punished every single one of his mistakes. Okay, the next game is Mamedyarov Carlsen from Wijk 2008. Magnus was 18 here. Here he was already over 2700. He was 2733. Now this game I chose because it's a very, very late middle game. It's not really an endgame yet. It's a queenless middle game, but the patterns are very similar to an endgame, and what I'm about to show you is probably my favorite final position in a Carlsen game. This game is a bit more famous, so you may know it. So here's the critical starting position, actually. Last move played by Carlsen was g5 and knight h3 played, and now the pawn simply marches forward to g4, gaining even more space. This is important because it fixes this king in this corner, and the king basically has 5 squares to move around on, well, 6 if you move the bishop, but this pawn is such a nuisance in the white position that there are constantly threats because of it. Fine, then I drops back to f4. Magnus now plays rook b6, targeting the only weakness he can actually target, the pawn on b2, and now the threat is to simply play rook b8 at some moment and target this pawn. It's really hard to liquidate it, either with b3, which would lose a pawn, or with b4, which would lose a pawn to en passant. So this is simply putting pressure on white's position. In this position, Mamedyarov plays knight h5. He would, of course, love to take this bishop and to pin this knight. That would be, I think, even slightly better for white. So bishop h8 just defends the bishop, saves his strongest piece on this diagonal, and because your target is on b2, then you definitely want to have this bishop. Okay, rook e to d2 played by Mamedyarov, which is a good move. And now rook e to b8, targeting the pawn. And here we reach a critical position. So what you can see is that Mamedyarov can at any point trade rooks with bishop c5. He can play rook d8 check after d takes c5, and he can simplify the position. The problem is that if he does that, then this rook is going to be able to enter the position on b2 at some point. And more importantly, if this bishop is gone and this bishop stays on the board on h8, then the e5 knight has extreme pressure on the queen side, on the center, and on the king side, with knight c4 threatening b2 and threatening knight e3. You can imagine that if one of these rooks infiltrates, then a knight on e3 would be game over. Why? Because this pawn is here and the king has no way to get out. So this bishop would be loose, this king would be unsafe. So critical position. Mamedyarov actually blundered the game away here with the things I'd mentioned already. So if you want, you can pause the video here and have a long think. This is an extremely tough position. Try to defend for white. The position is equal. So if you play precisely, you are equal. It's harder to play for white, but it's equal. So pause the video. Okay. It's hard to find a move, first of all, for white. I found two ideas which seem to work, although there are so many options for black that it gets complicated, and without moving the pieces, I just couldn't calculate everything. I did engine check my analysis later, which I don't normally do, but this was too much. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to show you what happened in the game. In the game, Mamedyarov took on c5. And of course, after d takes c5, this position is losing for white because of a very simple reason. White, even though he has rooks on the d file, has no counterplay and has too many weaknesses. So what happened was rook d8 check, and after king f7, Mamedyarov simplified with rook takes b8 and rook takes b8, and now he played rook to d2, defending his b2 pawn. But after knight c4, it's just all over. I think he was counting on rook d7 check, which was played in the game, and then king e8, and then rook takes pawn. And this seems like, well, white is just picking up material. Magnus here played bishop e5, and after rook a4, we are going to get to this position. This is 2 pawns up for white, and white is so lost that we are going to get to that. So take a mental note of this position and of the sort of counterplay Mamedyarov got after rook d8 and king f7 and rook b8 and rook b8 and rook d2, knight c4 and rook d7 check. So he did manage to pick up these 2 pawns. Now, here is what he should have done. Magnus also has a weakness in his position. And if we try to reach similar positions with Magnus's weakness highlighted in a way that b2 is highlighted, then white has very good counterplay. So there are 2 ideas: moving the bishop away to g1 and moving the bishop away to e3, which is probably better. It does not defend the king, but it does attack h6 and restricts the movement of the black king. So they have a similar idea, bishop to e3. Because the rooks have now unleashed an attack on d6, it's not easy for black to play this position. Firstly, you have kept your bishop. This knight doesn't really do that much. The knight could, of course, jump into d3 once the rook has moved, but not yet. So there are a couple of options. If rook takes b2 here, then rook takes d6 is in fact better for white, and everything is dropping. This knight could come to f4, pick up this pawn, get into g6. Way too much counterplay. Of course, this knight is undefended as well, so if rook a2, then bishop takes knight. So rook b2 wouldn't work. So let's have a look at other options. The most sensible move is knight c4, in my opinion, but now there's a simpler way to play this position. Even though it seems very similar, watch what happens. You can now take on c5, and after d takes c5 you can play rook d8. And if king f7, which is similar to what we saw previously, the difference is that this knight is no longer on e5, excuse me, and it's not controlling d7. So after rook 1 to d7 check, king g6, knight f4 check, and king f6, you can now continue knight h5 and simply go for a draw. If king e5 is played, then you can just play knight f4, and this position is great. This position should be better for white. If you try picking up material on the queen side, well, then e6 is about to drop and you will be in trouble. I shouldn't mention that if you take the pawn now, then you're just going to lose a rook. So it's not even possible to take on b2. So knight c4 wouldn't be good. Of course, it would be equal if white doesn't take on b2, but black doesn't take on b2, but it's not better for black. Okay, some more options. Knight f3 I thought was a sensible idea, just trying to trade off this bishop and, well, put pressure on e4. But now again, bishop takes c5, d takes c5, rook d8 check again. You can take on d8. If rook takes d8, then rook takes d8 and king h7, for example, and rook d7 check and king g6 and knight f4, and we have a fairly similar idea, knight f6. And again, if you try picking up material here, I'm going to, well, attack your e6 pawn and you're going to be worse. I could also throw in bishop takes knight at any point. And if after rook d8 you play king f7, then again, similarly, rook 1 to d7, king g6, rook f4, king f6, and we have the same thing. So against knight f3, pretty similar stuff would be happening. Another move which I tried to make work, which tries to get rid of all the issues we just mentioned, is king f7. Excuse me. Whoa, wait. After bishop e3, yeah, is king f7. So after king f7, seemingly we are, well, preparing to defend here with our king. But after the move knight f4, it's not easy again. If we don't take on b2, what do we do? If, for example, bishop f6, then white is perfectly fine. He has consolidated his position. He could take here, and I don't see any issues for white. If rook takes b2, then again rook takes d6, and rook takes g2, and knight takes g2, and knight takes e4 would lead to a very complicated position in which black has given up the exchange, but after something like rook d8, and knight g3 check, and king h2, and knight e2, white should be fine. Black has a ton of pawns for the exchange, but this again should be equal. And I got help from an engine for this one. I couldn't come up with this myself in a year, probably. So that's a very complicated continuation. So everything after bishop e3 seems to work. And let's disregard the engine lines with king f7. Let's just play normal human moves for white, for black, excuse me, which Magnus would have probably played, something like knight c4. We can see that white is fine because of this pressure on d6 and the pressure coming from knight f4. But let's get back to the game. Bishop takes c5, and this we saw dc5, rook d8, king f7, rook b8, rook b8, rook d2, defending the pawn, knight c4, and now Mamedyarov goes ahead and picks up all of these pawns. And in this position, black to play and win, believe it or not. Magnus played one more move, and Mamedyarov resigned. So you can pause the video here and try to find the move. The move played in the game was knight e3, and after this, white is just lost. White has 2 extra pawns, but his pieces are completely out of play. His king is unsafe. This structure is collapsing. This pawn will drop if the knight moves away. And let's have a look at some sensible continuations. I'm going to show you what the issue is. After, for example, b3, trying to save the pawn, you don't take here. It's not about grabbing pawns. It's much more deadly. Play rook d8. And after rook d8, there is no defense. There's no defense. If you try to save your bishop now with bishop f1, I'm going to take it. If you play the visually most appealing move, king g1, then I simply play rook to d2. And if bishop f1, then rook d1, of course. And if bishop h1, then rook d1 check. And if you play king h2, then knight f1 check, king to g2, knight to d2, and everything is dropping. For example, rook a7, trying to cut the king off. You just continue knight f3, and this bishop is falling after rook g1 check, whatever happens. And if after rook d1 you play king f2, then I don't have to take the bishop and lose my knight. I can throw in knight c2 and then take the bishop a bit later on. So yeah, that's what happened. One more thing after knight e3, if king g1 is played straight away, trying to get away from all this nonsense, then rook takes b2. And after bishop h1, we have a similar idea, just that the rook is not on d1 but on b1, but it's all the same, and the pawn is gone from b3. So this, I think, was this position after knight e3 is probably my favorite final Carlsen position, in which if you are walking through a tournament hall and you see this game, maybe you wouldn't be sure what's going on because white has 2 extra pawns, but upon a closer look, game over. Okay, third game. This game is nice because it's principled, and when you follow this game, it's almost like you're following an endgame textbook, showing you what to do first, what to do second, and then bam, 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 until you win. Unless your opponent plays perfectly, which Ivanchuk did not do. Okay, first move, it's Magnus to play with the white pieces. He plays h4, trying to expand on the king side and fix the king side. If this knight moves, then h5 could fix the weakness on h6. In this position, Ivanchuk actually played a fatal blunder. Now, this position is very hard to understand, and you would need to be, I think, master level or above to see why some king moves lose and some don't, at least quickly. So try to figure it out. What would you do here with black? I'm going to tell you before you start guessing or start calculating, there are ideas of getting the king into play and also getting this knight into a better position to d6. Okay, in the game, Ivanchuk played the most sensible move. A move you would play in blitz in a second. Just king d6, improving your king, making your position better, giving your knight the option to come to e7, both trading rooks and over-defending the d5 pawn. So king d6 makes perfect sense. Here's the issue. Magnus can now continue with the move h5. And the problem is that you cannot win a pawn with black because you played king d6. I know it sounds complicated, but let's look at it. So if g takes h5, you play knight f5 check. And there are two options. You can play, well, you can basically play either king c7, getting away from this, or you can play king e5. The move which you would like to play is king e5. But now, after knight e d4, this knight is pinned, so you cannot move it away. If you try hg4, for example, then f4 check, and now it's just all over. King e4, and you lose on the next move. I'm threatening two checkmates, this checkmate and this checkmate, and there's no way to save yourself. If, for example, I don't know, okay, let's say, okay, I have to play rook d1 to stop the king from going away. Now I'm threatening two checkmates. So this is over. Whatever you do, one knight move is going to be made. And if instead of king e5 you play king e7, which is much more prudent, then watch what happens here. This is much harder to see. So gh5, knight h5, and then this position, knight e7. Takes the knight, attacks the rook, so rook d8. Saves the rook, and in this position you don't liquidate, you don't take, of course, you play knight d4. And even though white is a pawn down in this position, this is much better for white. On their level, on 2800 level, it's winning. So for example, rook d6, you can now just continue with b4 and try to threaten a4, b5. And this knight cannot move easily. One of these pawns is going to drop. So once one of these pawns drop, you are going to have a passed pawn, and you're going to have two connected passed pawns if you take the f7 pawn. So this would be very hard to deal with. So probably king d7 in this position. And white's pieces are just so active that the fact that he is a pawn down is irrelevant. He's going to get it back. Okay, so after h5, you cannot take the pawn. We just saw why. So now let's figure out what Ivanchuk should have done instead of king d6, which does not allow knight f5 check. So instead, in this position, to prevent h5, he should have played king d7, which still allows this and still allows this. Doesn't bring the king that close to the center, but actually prevents h5, because now against h5 you can just take. And if gh5, that's it. You can just trade on d4, rook takes c8, king takes c8, knight takes d4. Another thing which I forgot to mention, king d6 does not defend the rook, king d7 defends the rook. So all of these lines after h5 work because the rook is defended and because there's no knight f5 check. So I know this is complicated stuff, but I think that's why it's instructive. That's at least what I thought when I was first analyzing this game. So playing natural king moves in complicated endgames is almost always a mistake, even if you get it right, because you don't know why it was right. So, back to the game. King d6 played, h5 played. We know that Ivanchuk cannot take. So he played knight e7, preventing knight f5. Of course, this is a much more sensible move than taking on h5, also offering a rook trade. If you trade rooks, this is going to be a draw, and no doubt about that. Even though the knight is misplaced on c8, it's going to be a draw. So Magnus declines with rook h1. Of course, not to take on h5 with the rook, but to get your rook to a more active square and to avoid the trade. So gh5, gh5. Rook g8 played. In this position, knight g3. Now both knights are looking at f5. And now, if we compare this to the starting position in which Magnus played h4, black's position is busted. Now, let's just go back to the starting position after h4. Why is this much better for black than the position on move 42 that we saw? Well, black's pawns are all connected, and Black's pawns are not easy to target. If we go back to move 42 after knight g3, all 3 pawns are loose. The c file is, well, up for grabs. And Magnus has no weaknesses. The only weakness he has is the h5 pawn, but it's already defended twice. Ivanchuk continues rook g5, and now Magnus proceeds to stage 2, and this is what I find remarkable. So all the action is currently on the king side, on the h and g files, and the main weaknesses are on the king side, and your knights are looking at f5. What does Magnus do? He plays b4. This makes sure that the black king can never enter the queen side. Also tries to fix the queen side, create some weaknesses over there. If one of these or both of these pawns also become weaknesses, then it's going to be overwhelming. King d7 played, rook h4 played, knight e8 in this position, rook f4 targeting f7, knight d6 defends f7, a4, b6, and now a5. And again, another weakness fixed after ba5, it's just you have another target on a6. So now it's just about who's going to be quicker. The problem for black is that he cannot be quick enough to defend everything. This is just too weak. f5 played by Ivanchuk, which by the way highlights the weakness some more, because now it's attacked 3 times. Okay, rook h4, Magnus decides to do this and win the game. That's a good plan. Knight c4 attacks a5, and f4 attacks the rook, so gaining a tempo. And after rook g4, rook h3 played. In this position, if you take on a5, then of course all of this is going to drop. So knight d6, defending instead of taking this pawn. Now simply rook h1, and now this rook is misplaced. Now this pawn is not attacked. This pawn is still attacked twice, so you cannot move your knights, and my rook is just going to get to b1, and that's it. So rook g8 played, getting the rook back into play. Rook b1 played, and Ivanchuk passively plays rook a8. I mean, what else do you do? I was looking at knight c6, but now just knight d takes f5, and if knight c4, preventing rook here, I don't even have to take. I can play rook b7 first and just win afterwards. But rook a8 played, and now Magnus doesn't rush. He plays to improve all of his pieces first. The knights cannot move. The rook is restricted. I should also say that the d6 knight shouldn't move because of rook b7. So now stage 3, make your king as better until it's optimal. King f3. Now there's no more progress to be made. So, and Ivanchuk actually has to make a move. So he could wait with rook a7, I believe. But that would allow rook b6. King c7 played instead. Knight e6 check. King to c8 and knight to c5, and this is it. Now if you play knight c6, trying to attack this pawn, then I can play rook b6 and this is over. If king c7, then knight takes a6 check. And after knight c5, if you play knight c4, trying to prevent rook b6, then rook b7. And once you get your knight out of the way, rook h7 wins because the a pawn queens. So in this position, Ivanchuk simply conceded and played rook b8, which is just, yeah. Rook takes b8, king takes b8, knight a6. We move on to stage 4. So this part is probably the most instructive part because these endgames tend to end in a draw more often than not. King b7 played, knight b4. And now what's your plan? Well, probably from this point you have to be able to calculate the entire endgame with all the forcing moves and all the sacrifices, and you have to look at checks, captures and forcing moves first. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video again, and after knight c4 by black, figure out how you would play out this position with Magnus's pieces. Okay, so he starts with a6, king b6, and king e2, improving his king. After knight d6, king d3, the king marches up the board. Remember that the black king cannot march up the board anywhere because the a pawn is going to queen. So knight b5, now preventing a7, knight e2, looking at the d4 square, king a5, knight c3. Okay, so in this position, if you take the knight, then my pawn is far too dangerous. Okay, because I can take here, so here, 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 and here, and that's it. So after knight c3, the knight cannot be taken. Knight c7 played, attacks the pawn. And now, final little bit of calculation. White to play and win. Find the winning continuation. Okay. Sacrificing a piece. Knight takes, knight takes, knight takes, knight takes, a7. Okay, knight c7 forced. King d4, king b6, king e5, king a7, king f5, and game over. This knight is, well, useless. It cannot defend against two pawns. So what happened was knight d5, king g6, knight e3, king h6, and Ivanchuk resigned. This is completely winning. This a pawn is just about the queen. There's no way you can stop both pawns when the king is on a7. So yeah, these are three of my favorite Magnus endgames from his early career. I'm going to make part 2 with more modern games soon. I just think his play is extraordinary. I hope you learned something. Again, give me your recommendations for modern games if you want, and any feedback is appreciated. Hope you liked the video, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.